So there were, it says there are, but there were 5 major investment banks in the United States during this financial crisis, at the start of the financial crisis. Okay? Lehman Brothers was a 100-plus year old investment house. They went bankrupt. The financial system froze. And I'm not just talking in the United States. When Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the entire financial system of the world broke. And it was virtually impossible for anybody on the planet Earth to get a loan. Okay? The U.S. government let Lehman Brothers go bust because they thought the market would adjust and fix things out. Instead, the market froze, and the government learned its lesson, and it needed to be involved to make things work. So the Fed steps in and, calms everybody down. Okay? Bear Stearns goes bankrupt. And J.P. Morgan buys it for a couple $100 million for nothing. It's nothing. The CEO of Bear Stearns, while his company is going bankrupt, he's out of town at a bridge tournament with his cell phone turned off. He's out of town at a bridge tournament with his cell phone turned off, and yet he walks away with hundreds of millions of dollars that he made from that company, and no penalty of any kind for letting his company go bankrupt, not paying attention, blah, blah, blah. When I was in college, I dated his daughter for a while. He was just a stockbroker back then. But if I had known he was going to be a billionaire, I might have hung in there longer, yes? But he was playing bridge. This is how the system's not supposed to work, right? If you make a company lose billions and billions and billions of dollars, you shouldn't get a buyout package. But all these guys, the people who are running all of these companies that went bankrupt, they walked away with 30 million, 50 million, 150 million. They got paid these huge amounts of money and took no consequences of any kind for anything that they did wrong. The U.S. government pays Bank of America $29 billion to buy Merrill Lynch because they're bankrupt. $29 billion of taxpayer money. Okay? Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are the other two. They're both survivors of this, but the government made them become commercial banks. They were investment banks before. The government made them become commercial banks, which means business banks, and that means that the Federal Reserve has oversight responsibilities on Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley that it didn't have before the financial crisis. Okay? So they're still around, but they're commercial banks. They're no longer technically that investment bank. Okay. So, did the government ever bail banks out before this? And it turns out that the governments have bailed the banks out a lot of times. Every time there's a financial crisis and people go, bailouts, we never done those. The first bank bailout in American history was in 1813. It was after the War of 1812. The banking system was in trouble. The federal government bailed out banks all over the country. Okay? So this is not an unusual occurrence. We've done it many times. Sometimes haven't done it when we should have, but so the U.S. takes over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage companies. That cost us $200 billion. We paid $85 billion to buy AIG. The United States bought 80% of AIG. Taxpayers actually got their money back. We actually sold off AIG. The government put up $700 billion to buy toxic assets from banks. They didn't buy any. The Federal Reserve ended up buying a lot of them. But the $700 billion that Congress allocated to buy them got spent in other ways because they couldn't figure out how to buy any toxic assets. That was a thing called TARP. The government bought out GM. They bought out Chrysler. They salvaged a bunch of banks. Okay, the government became very active in the economy trying to fix things. All right. Great Depression. Right? The Great Depression was this horrible financial collapse. In 1933 and 34, there's a series of acts passed, which people refer to as the Glass-Steagall Acts. The guy on the left is a guy named Carter Glass. That's the young him, not the old him, but the young him. He wrote the Federal Reserve Act that created the Federal Reserve, and then he's still in the Senate, and he writes this Glass-Steagall Act in 33-34. It separates financial institutions by function. So it takes banks out of the stock market. If you understand what happened in the Great Depression, there was a bubble, but it was a bubble in the stock market. Okay? Banks were taking money basically and investing it in the stock market. So you put your money in the bank, they're betting on it in the stock market. Well, what happens if the stock market crashes? Stock market crashes, the banks go bust. Right? They can't pay people back because they lose all their money. So Glass-Steagall says, look, there are stockbrokers and they can't do banking things. There are banks and they can't do stockbroker things. There are credit unions and they can make loans and take deposits, but they can't have checking accounts. And blah, blah. Every different kind of financial institution is put into a little silo that this thing can do this. Banks don't make home loans. These home savings and loans make home loans. Stockbrokers can't be banks. They can't make home loans. They can just go into the stock market. So you had to have a bank account for your banking and a separate company to do your stock trading. Okay? Everything was separated. They created the FDIC, so there was no bank insurance before that, right? If your bank went bust, you just lost all your money. Since 1933, there's been the FDIC. Okay? We talked about that before. In the 70 years before Glass-Steagall passes, there were 4 major financial panics in the United States where at least a third of all the banks in the country disappeared. 4 times in 70 years. In the 70 years that Glass-Steagall is in effect, there was not a single major financial panic in the United States. None. 0. In the 20 years since Glass-Steagall, we've had 1. And the interesting question is, were we headed for another one that coronavirus took out? But we might have been headed for another crash. Certainly if you're Minsky or Hayek, you believe that we were really close to another crash coming. And the crash happened because of everybody's getting sick. So the problem with Glass-Steagall, not only we have Glass-Steagall, but we banned interstate banking. Now let me be clear about this. From the Great Depression until 2000, from the Great Depression to 2000, banks could only operate in one state. And in fact, way before that too, banks could only generally operate in one state. So J.P. Morgan, which you think of as, the guy, right, the banking guy of the world, they had one branch on Wall Street, and that was their only bank. They weren't allowed to have a bank in California or Ohio. Okay? Banks had to operate in only one state. So there was Bank of America, but really it was a whole bunch of separate banks. There was Bank of America Nevada, Bank of America California, Bank of America Utah, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The interstate banking law, the requirement, that means if you think about it, U.S. banks are going to be really small. Japanese banks are much bigger than U.S. banks. German banks are much bigger than U.S. banks. There's all these banks all over the world that are way bigger than U.S. banks. And that means that U.S. multinational companies, the big U.S. companies like a General Motors or an IBM, can't use U.S. banks to do their banking because they need to be global, and U.S. banks are not global. Okay? So there's a serious, serious problem. If we want to maintain and be the number one financial country in the world, we have a problem. Okay? The world's changing, and our system doesn't allow us to change with it. So in 1994, we repeal interstate banking. It doesn't go into effect till 2000, but it's only been roughly in your lifetime, if you're a college student, that there's been interstate banking in the United States. Before that, there was no interstate banking. Your bank was just in the single state. Okay? And in 1999, Congress passed a law, Graham-Leach-Bliley it's called. It prohibits the SEC from regulating derivatives, and it gets rid of Glass-Steagall. Okay? So Glass-Steagall goes away in 1999. You should note that if you're saying, well, it's the Republicans' fault, or it's the Graham-Leach-Bliley, the law that eliminates Glass-Steagall, passed unanimously in the United States Senate. Let me say that again. It passed unanimously in the United States Senate. All the Republicans and all the Democrats voted for it. It was written by 3 Republicans, but all the Democrats and all the Republicans voted for it. And in the House, there were 30-something people that voted against it. So a tenth of the House, right? 90+% of the people in the House voted for it. And it's signed into law. This is a picture of it being signed into law by Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. So the Democrats and Republicans jointly did this. They worked together, unanimously almost, to do this to us. Okay? just a thought here. Look at this picture. What do you notice about all the people in the picture except for the one woman in the red, and then there's another woman kind of hiding behind her? Yeah. We'll be back to that in a second. So after the crisis, we create this new law called Dodd-Frank, which is named after Dodd and Frank. That's Barney Frank in the red tie there at the edge of the table, and Dodd behind him with the green tie. Signed into law by Obama. It creates something called the Volcker Rule. Paul Volcker was the chair of the Federal Reserve under Carter and Reagan, the first Bush, and into Clinton, actually. Paul Volcker said, look, the answer to this is simple. And he proposed a 4-page rule. And the rule basically said, if you're a bank and you're going to sell bonds, you have to keep some of them. How do we make banks play fair? Well, if they know they're issuing bad bonds, they don't want to keep them. They're going to sell them all. So if you make them keep a significant percentage of those bonds themselves and put them in their own portfolio, that gives them a disincentive, right? It helps to prevent them from selling garbage, because then they have to keep that garbage themselves. They have to keep part of it in their own portfolio. Okay? It's a simple rule, 4 pages long. Congress turned it into a 70-page rule full of exceptions and loopholes and blah, 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 blah. Okay? So in the final version, it's about 70 pages long when the original version was 4 pages long. Okay? It also creates the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, which was the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. Still around, but President Trump put a person in charge of it who doesn't think it should really exist and isn't really enforcing any of the stuff. This law is 2,000 pages long, and you know I'm not a big fan of politicians of any party. Anytime there's a law that's 2,000 pages long, it's going to be screwed up. It's just not going to work. There's going to be stuff wrong with it, right? So it's not even clear that the people who voted for this understood, but it did do some good things. It put in the Volcker Rule, created the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, allowed the SEC to make regulations on derivatives, did a bunch of other things. Okay? Now, just compare pictures. What do you notice about this picture compared to that picture? And I'm not picking on old white guys, because I one day will be an old white guy. But it seems like whenever there's a law that's signed and everybody in the picture is an old white guy, it turns out bad. And whenever there's a picture and there's women and people of color and there's a diverse group of people getting together to do this, it's not nearly so bad. Just saying. Okay? I'm overgeneralizing there, but I like that picture better than I like that picture. Anyway, just a thought. And that's Harry Reid there. If you don't recognize him, he was the senator from Nevada, right behind President Obama. So what are we doing about Dodd-Frank now? Well, Jamie Dimon, who's the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest financial organization in the planet Earth, has argued repeatedly that we need to kill Dodd-Frank, that consumers would be better off if banks didn't have to follow all these rules. Consumers would be better off. Yeah. President Trump promised repeatedly repeal it. It hasn't been repealed. But what he was able to do when Dodd-Frank was passed, any bank that had more than $50 billion in assets fell under it. He raised that limit to $250 billion, President Trump has, which means that groups like American Express don't have enough assets now that they're covered by Dodd-Frank. It severely limited the number of financial institutions that are actually covered by Dodd-Frank. Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, has argued that we can weaken the Volcker Rule, that it doesn't need to be as strong as it is, and President Trump would like to get rid of it. So this is something to keepeth thy eyes on over time, is what happens to this law, right? Again, it's a 2,000-page law. There's a lot of stuff in it that's not very good. And it's one of those things like the Obamacare is a 2,000-page law, and it had problems in it that everybody knew the day it was passed, it couldn't survive as it was passed. But these laws need to get changed, and Congress never seems to get around to fixing them until something falls apart. So, again, not a big fan of Congresses and politicians and stuff, but it never seems to work. Okay? So who's in charge? And again, the point is, who's in charge? Who's supposed to protect us from there being another big financial panic? We call this problem systemic risk. There are risks that affect the entire financial system. Systemic risk. You like that? A systemic risk is a risk that affects the entire system, the entire financial system. Who's in charge of looking for those? Well, the answer is nobody. There's actually a committee. Again, all of these entities are part of a committee, the Federal Reserve and the SEC and the FDI. They're all part of this committee. But the idea that a committee is going to protect us from financial irregularities just seems like asking for trouble, right? The guy on the left thinks he's in charge. The guy on the right is really in charge.